Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The rain had just begun to patter against the window panes of my third-floor apartment, a soft, rhythmic ticking that seemed to sync with the slow, languid blink of the power as it died, plunging the living room into a deep, velvety silence broken only by the sound of our breathing and the sudden, insistent drumming of the storm outside. Eliza, her face illuminated by the warm, dancing glow of the dozen or so candles we'd scavenged from kitchen drawers and the back of the linen closet, smiled at me from across the coffee table, her features rendered both softer and more severe by the flickering light. A classic portrait of curious anticipation that made my own pragmatic heart feel a fond, if slightly exasperated, squeeze. "It'll be fun," she'd said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as she'd pulled the flat, rectangular box from her tote bag, the word Ouija emblazoned in that classic, vaguely ominous script across the top. A proper spooky night in. And I, a man of 32 who prided himself on a worldview built on solid, unspectacular truths, the reliability of a well-balanced checkbook, the simple cause and effect of a leaky faucet, the undeniable fact that dead was dead, had agreed, partly because the blackout had killed the television and our phones were down to 10%, but mostly because the way the candlelight caught in her dark eyes was a kind of magic I was still learning to believe in. The board itself felt cheap under my fingertips, a flimsy piece of printed cardboard with a glossy finish, the alphabet arranged in two shallow arcs, the numbers lined up beneath, the words yes and no sitting in the corners like solemn sentinels, and the planchette, that heart-shaped window on three little felted feet, felt even lighter, almost toy-like, as we placed our fingers on it with a self-consciousness that made me want to crack a joke to break the tension. "Okay, oh great and powerful spirit realm," I began, my voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "Anybody home? Any messages for the living from the dearly departed?" The planchette remained stubbornly still, a piece of plastic and wood under our tentative fingers, and I shot Eliza a look that I hoped conveyed both my amusement and my affection for her for indulging in this bit of nonsense. She shushed me playfully, her expression turning serious, or at least a credible imitation of seriousness. "We have to be respectful," she whispered, and I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling, and then she asked, her voice clear and steady, "Is there anyone here who would like to speak with us?" For a long moment, nothing happened, and I was just about to suggest we open a bottle of wine instead when I felt it, or thought I felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in the planchette, a vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Did you?" Eliza started, but I cut her off with a shake of my head, my own skepticism now peaked, my rational mind scrambling for an explanation. A subtle muscle twitch in my own hand, a draft from the window, the natural, unconscious micro-movements of two people trying to hold something perfectly still. But then it moved again, a slow, deliberate slide across the smooth surface of the board, heading decisively toward the yes in the upper corner, and my breath hitched in my throat, not out of fear, but out of a pure scientific surprise. It felt real, this movement, it felt guided, and for a fleeting second, I allowed myself to consider the impossible before my brain, my ever-faithful editor, provided the likely script. The ideomotor effect, a well-documented psychological phenomenon where people make motions unconsciously, our bodies responding to our expectations without any conscious volition. Of course, that was it. We were moving it ourselves because we wanted something to happen, because the candlelight and the storm and the novelty of the moment demanded it. Emboldened by this explanation, I decided to play along, to see how far our collective subconscious would take us. "What's your name?" Eliza asked, her voice hushed with a thrilling mixture of trepidation and excitement, and the planchette began to move, spelling out a jumble of letters that made no sense. GXB-R, a chaotic, nonsensical string that reinforced my theory. It was just our random, unguided movements, our fingers fumbling toward meaning but finding only gibberish. We asked a few more frivolous questions, getting answers that were either vague or silly, the planchette zipping to yes. When I asked if it liked pizza, and to an O. When Eliza asked if it was a friendly spirit, and I relaxed into the game of it, enjoying the shared experience, the way our knees touched under the table, the way her eyes sparkled in the dim light, the entire evening feeling like a quirky, intimate date rather than a genuine foray into the occult. One more question, I said, feeling magnanimous. Then we really should find those candles for the bathroom. Eliza nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. Spirit, she asked, her tone formal. Do you have a message for us? For me or for Ben? The air in the room seemed to grow still, the candle flames ceasing their dance for a heartbeat, and the planchette beneath our fingers went from a light, almost skittish thing to something anchored, something dense and purposeful, as if a third, heavier hand had settled atop ours. It began to move, not with the erratic, meandering path of before, but with a slow, terrifying certainty, a grim deliberation that felt entirely alien to the playful mood of moments earlier. It slid, with a soft scraping sound that was the only noise in the world, to the letter F. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a primal warning. It moved to I, then to R, and then, with a finality that was utterly chilling, to E. Fire. The word hung in the air between us, a stark, ugly statement. Eliza's eyes met mine, wide and questioning, and I could see the first flicker of real fear in them, a fear I wanted immediately to quash. Coincidence, I said, my voice sounding brittle and false even to my own ears. Probably some old Victorian ghost who died in a factory blaze. Let's stop. But the planchette was moving again, of its own volition it seemed, dragging our reluctant fingers with it, a force that felt both immense and subtle, an undertow pulling us out to a dark sea. It spelled another word, each letter a hammer blow to the suddenly fragile peace of the evening. N. U. R. S. E. R. Y. Nursery. Fire nursery. The words echoed in the profound silence, and I did the only thing my reeling mind could think to do. I laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound, a bark of nervous dismissal that tore through the quiet. Well, that's ridiculous, I said, pulling my hands away from the planchette as if it had grown suddenly hot, breaking the connection with a finality that felt cowardly. I never had a nursery. My parents' house is a ranch style. I was in a room next to theirs. And there was never any fire. Definitely not. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and went to the window, pretending to look out at the rain-swept street below, but really just needing to turn my back on the board, on those two words that felt like an accusation. It's just our minds, I said, more to convince myself than her. You think fire. Your brain goes to nursery because it's a scary place for a fire. It's a primal fear. It's nothing. Eliza was quiet for a long time, and when I finally turned to look at her, she was staring at the board, her brow furrowed. It felt different, she said softly, not arguing, just stating a fact. The way it moved at the end. It didn't feel like us. I insisted it was. We cleaned up the board. The power came back on with a sudden, blinding hum of electricity that made us both jump, and we spent the rest of the evening watching a mindless sitcom. The loud laughter of the canned audience a welcome shield against the quiet unease that had settled over us, an unease I refused to acknowledge, burying it under jokes and commentary about the show's predictable plot. But later, in the dark, with Eliza sleeping soundly beside me, those two words returned, echoing in the silent theater of my mind, fire nursery. They became a relentless, unsolvable riddle, a splinter in my consciousness I couldn't dig out. It wasn't fear that kept me awake, not at first. It was a profound, gnawing confusion. My childhood was not a mystery to me. It was a well-documented, pleasantly mundane album of memories. Family vacations to the beach, little league games, birthdays, Christmases. There were no dramatic events, no tragedies, certainly no house fires. My mother was a worrier, a keeper of meticulous photo albums and medical records. A fire, however small, would have been a landmark event, a story told and retold, a cautionary tale about electrical safety. The absolute certainty of its non-existence in my personal history was a wall my mind kept bumping against, yet the words had been spelled out with such chilling conviction. Over the next few days, the echo became a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my thoughts, a cognitive itch I couldn't scratch. I'd be reviewing a spreadsheet at work, and the letters would swim before my eyes, rearranging themselves into fire. I'd be washing dishes and see the pattern of suds on a plate and think of the heart-shaped planchette sliding to Y. It was absurd, maddening. Finally, on the third day, driven less by belief and more by a desperate need to resolve the cognitive dissonance, to prove to the irrational part of my brain how silly it was being, I called my mother. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I pictured her in her sun-drenched kitchen, probably sorting coupons or planning dinner. I leaned back in my office chair, aiming for a light, jocular tone. "Hey, Mom, you'll never guess what we did the other night during the blackout." I regaled her with the story, playing up my own skepticism, making Eliza out to be the adorable, slightly spooky enthusiast, setting the scene for the punchline. "And then this thing," I said, chuckling. "It spells out the weirdest thing. Fire nursery. Can you believe it? Like some kind of bad horror movie." I told Eliza it was nonsense, I said. My mom would have told me if my nursery had burned down. I expected her to laugh, to maybe chide me for playing with something so silly, to launch into a story about one of her friends who'd had a creepy experience with a board game. But instead, there was nothing. Not a sound. The line was so dead silent, I pulled my phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped. It hadn't. The seconds stretched, each one a lifetime, filled with a void so heavy it felt like a physical pressure in my ear. "Mom," I said, my forced cheerfulness evaporating, replaced by a cold trickle of apprehension. Then I heard it, a sharp, ragged intake of breath, the kind of sound someone makes when they've been punched in the stomach. When she finally spoke, her voice was unrecognizable, thin, reedy, stripped of all its usual warmth and cadence, a ghost of a voice. "Benjamin," she said, and the way she said my name, with a weight I hadn't heard since I was a child in serious trouble, made the blood drain from my face. "You need to come over. Right now." "What? Why? What is it?" I asked, my own voice tight. I can't talk about this on the phone," she whispered, and I could hear the tremor in it, a vibration of pure, unadulterated fear. "Just come. Please. Now." The 20-minute drive to my childhood home was a blur of gray rain and a roaring in my ears that had nothing to do with the engine. My rational mind was throwing up every possible explanation. She was upset we'd used a Ouija board. She was playing an elaborate joke. She'd misheard me. But the sound of her voice, that shattered, terrified whisper, kept cutting through the noise. It was the voice of a woman whose deepest, most secret vault had been cracked open. I kept seeing the planchette moving, that slow, dreadful certainty. It didn't feel like us. Eliza's words came back to me, and for the first time, a genuine, icy fear began to seep into my bones. I pulled into the driveway of the familiar ranch house, its white siding and green shutters looking exactly as they always had, a picture of suburban normalcy that now felt like a lie. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lemon polish and simmering soup doing nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart. My mother was standing in the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she were cold. She was still in her gardening clothes, but her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked ancient, as if the last 10 minutes had aged her a decade. She didn't say a word, just looked at me with an expression of such profound dread and grief that my questions died in my throat. She gestured for me to sit on the floral sofa where I'd watched countless cartoons, and she sat in my father's armchair, leaning forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Before I tell you this," she began, her voice still that awful, thin whisper, "you have to understand, we never meant to lie. It was a decision made out of love, out of fear. We thought it was for the best. We wanted to bury it, to forget it ever happened." She took another shaky breath, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder, looking into the past. "You were about 6 months old. It was a Tuesday, I remember because your father was working late. I just put you down for a nap in your crib. I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I heard it, a faint pop, like a light bulb blowing, but it came from down the hall, from your room. Her hands began to tremble violently in her lap. I didn't think much of it at first, but then, oh God, Ben, then I smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke, something acrid plastic. Her eyes finally met mine, and they were swimming in tears of pure, undiluted terror. A terror 3 decades old, but as fresh as if it were happening right now. I ran. I threw open your door, and I saw it. A thin tendril of black smoke was curling out from behind your crib. There was an outlet back there, for a nightlight we never used. There was a small, bright orange flame licking at the wall, at the baseboard. The wallpaper, it had those little rocking horses on it, was starting to blacken and curl. She was crying openly now, silent tears tracking through her powder. The room was already filling with smoke. You were sleeping, but you were starting to cough, a little wet baby cough. I screamed. I don't even remember what I did. I think I grabbed you first, pulled you from the crib, ran and put you in your playpen in the living room. And then I ran back with the fire extinguisher your father insisted we keep under the kitchen sink. I emptied it onto the wall, onto the outlet. It made a terrible mess, white powder everywhere, but it put it out. It was out. She wiped her face with a trembling hand, leaving a smear of mascara. The damage was so minimal. A scorched patch on the baseboard and the wall behind the crib, a melted outlet. The electrician came the next day, said it was a faulty batch of outlets. He replaced it all through the house. We repainted the room ourselves. We moved the crib to a different wall. We cleaned every speck of soot and powder. By the next day, there was no sign it had ever happened. No sign at all. She looked at me, her expression pleading for understanding. But for me, for us, the sign was everywhere. The image of that flame, so close to your crib, of the smoke filling the room you were sleeping in, it was all we could see. The what if? What if I'd been in the shower? What if the smoke alarm hadn't been right outside the door? What if I'd been seconds later? The guilt was paralyzing. We felt like we'd failed you, that our home wasn't safe. Your father and I, we decided that night. We would never speak of it, not to anyone, not to our parents, not to our friends, and most of all, not to you. We would lock it away. We didn't want that fear, that shadow, to ever be a part of your life. We wanted you to feel safe in that room, in this house. We buried it. We swore we would take it to our graves. She fell silent, the weight of her confession pressing down on the both of us. The room felt airless. I could only stare at her, my mind trying to process this new, horrific piece of my history, a piece that had been deliberately excised from the album. The Ouija board hadn't been nonsense. It hadn't been a joke. It had spelled out a secret my conscious mind had never known, but one that had lived, festering and terrified, in the psyche of the woman now weeping before me. How? I finally whispered, my own voice hoarse. How could it know? My mother just shook her head, a world of helpless, terrified wonder in her eyes. And then, slowly, as if moving through deep water, she rose from her chair. Come, she said. She led me down the familiar hallway, past the framed family photos that told the smooth, edited story of our lives, to the door of my old room, now a neutral, beige guest room. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and a desperate need for proof, for something tangible to attach this impossible story to. She walked to the far wall, where a heavy, oak dresser had stood for as long as I could remember, its surface cluttered with a spare lamp and a stack of old magazines. Help me, she said, her voice barely audible. Together, we grunted and strained, sliding the cumbersome piece of furniture away from the wall, its feet scraping harshly on the hardwood floor. A cloud of dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the window. And there it was. Behind where the dresser had been, hidden from view for over 30 years, on the plain white baseboard was a mark. It was faint, a ghost of its former self, a long, jagged stain of darkness that had seeped into the grain of the wood, a shadow of flame and smoke. The edges were blurred with time, but its shape was unmistakable. a violent, upward-reaching streak, a fossilized moment of pure terror. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and traced the outline of the scorch mark. It felt like nothing, just smooth old wood, but to my fingertips it was the most real, the most terrifying thing I had ever touched. This was the proof. Not a story, not a repressed memory, but a physical scar on the house, a testament to a moment that had been so thoroughly erased from my history that its existence was impossible. And yet, a piece of cardboard and plastic from across town, guided by our fingers in a candlelit room, had known. It had reached across the city, through the storm, into the deepest, most locked-away chamber of my mother's heart, and it had pulled out this single burning secret. The Ouija board hadn't been talking to a ghost. It had been talking to her. It had given voice to her most profound, most carefully buried fear. A memory so potent and so horrifying that its echo, 3 decades later, had enough energy to move a planchette and shatter my understanding of reality. I stood there, my hand still on the wall, staring at that faint, dark scar, and felt the world I knew, a world of logic, of cause and effect, of known history, crumble to dust around me, leaving me standing in a terrifying new landscape where the past was not dead, where secrets did not stay buried, and where the walls of our own minds were far more fragile and far more transparent than I could have ever possibly imagined. And in that moment, the world didn't just feel different, it was different, the very atoms of the air seeming to realign themselves around this impossible, verified truth, the foundation of my identity, my known past, my understood present, my predictable future, cracking apart with an almost audible splintering sound that I knew was only in my head, but felt as real as the rough texture of the scorched wood beneath my trembling fingertips. I stayed like that for a long time, crouched on the floor of my old nursery, my hand pressed against the ghost of a flame that had lived silently in this house. And in my mother's mind, for longer than I had been consciously aware of my own existence, the weight of the revelation of physical pressure on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath, the image of my mother as a young woman, terrified and alone, fighting a nascent fire to save her baby, superimposing itself over the reality of her now, this aged, devastated figure weeping quietly in the doorway, and I felt a confusing, turbulent whirlpool of emotions, anger at the secret, a profound pity. For her decades of carrying this alone, a dizzying sense of violation that something, some unknowable mechanism, had rifled through the locked drawers of her soul and displayed their contents to me on a child's game board. I finally stood up, my knees cracking in the silence, and looked at my mother, really looked at her, seeing not just my parent but a person, a woman haunted by a single, crystallized moment of potential loss, a moment she had relived every day for 30 years in the secret theater of her mind, and any anger I might have felt evaporated, replaced by a crushing, helpless sorrow for her, for the weight she had chosen to bear for me, a weight that had now, through some inexplicable means, been transferred onto my own shoulders. Why? I finally asked, the word coming out as a croak. Why didn't you ever tell me, even when I was grown? She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, a gesture so childlike it broke my heart. At first, it was because we wanted to protect you, to let you grow up without that shadow in your house, she whispered, her voice raw. And then, as the years went on, it just became a fact. A thing that happened. It was so far in the past, it felt like digging up a bone to talk about it. It was easier to just let it stay buried. We never, ever imagined, she trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the scorch mark, a visible manifestation of the invisible scar she carried. How could it know, Ben? How could that thing know? I had no answer for her. My rational mind, my faithful old guard, was utterly routed, its explanations, coincidence, the ideomotor effect, cold reading, lying in tatters at my feet, annihilated by the physical evidence of the scorch mark. This was no longer psychology. It was something else, something for which I had no name. A terrifying porosity between minds, a leakage of the most intimate, guarded information across town, through stormy air, into a piece of plastic. We moved the dresser back, hiding the evidence once more, though we both knew it changed nothing. The secret was out, its spectral energy now loose in the world, and the knowledge of it would forever color this room, this house, my entire childhood. I drove home in a complete daze, the familiar streets of my town looking alien and sinister. Every house I passed seeming to hold its own silent, hidden tragedies behind its neat lawns and curtained windows. And I wondered what other secrets were humming in the air, what other repressed guilts and fears were waiting for a conduit, a chance to spell themselves out and shatter someone's reality. When I walked into my apartment, Eliza was there, her face etched with concern. She'd gotten my garbled, frantic text saying I was going to my mom's and that something was wrong. And the moment she saw my face, she knew. "Ben, what happened? You're white as a sheet." I walked past her to the kitchen, poured a glass of water with hands that still wouldn't stay steady, and drank it down in one long gulp, trying to find the words, trying to find a way to articulate the unthinkable. I led her to the couch and I told her everything. The whole story from the moment my mother's voice had changed on the phone to the moment I traced the scorch mark on the wall. And as I spoke, I watched her expression shift from concern to disbelief, to dawning horror, and finally to a kind of awestruck terror that mirrored my own. She didn't try to offer me a rational explanation. She just listened, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, and when I was finished, she was silent for a long time. "It pulled it from her," she said finally, her voice hushed. "It didn't contact a dead person. It contacted a living one. It reached into her head, and it took her worst memory, her most guarded secret, and it gave it to us." The implications of that settled over us like a shroud. It meant that privacy, the sanctity of our own inner worlds, was an illusion. It meant that the past was not a static record, but a living, energetic thing, and that profound emotional events, especially those shrouded in silence and shame, could apparently resonate across space, waiting for an antenna to pick up their signal. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake next to Eliza, staring at the ceiling, the words "Fire Nursery" now burned onto the back of my eyelids, and my mind raced in frantic, terrified circles, trying to find a new footing in a world that had fundamentally changed its rules. The horror wasn't in a ghost or a demon. It was in the realization that our minds are not the sealed, private fortresses we believe them to be. The horror was in the idea that my mother's most private terror had been a tangible, detectable thing, a signal broadcast for 30 years, and that a Ouija board, a cheap piece of cardboard, had somehow tuned into its frequency. It was a violation of the highest order, a psychic burglary that left me feeling exposed and utterly vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, a strange, tense new normal settled in. My mother and I tiptoed around each other, bound together by this horrific, shared knowledge, our relationship forever altered. The Ouija board was gone. I had taken it from Eliza's tote bag the next day, and in a fit of cold, rational fear, sawed it into pieces and buried it in the dumpster behind my building, a pathetic attempt to contain something that clearly could not be contained. Eliza was supportive but equally shaken, and our previously light-hearted curiosity about the paranormal had been replaced by a sober, fearful respect. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of my own thoughts, my own memories, wondering which of my repressed guilts or shames might have taken on a life of its own, might be humming away in some corner of my psyche, waiting for a chance to be discovered by some other party game from beyond. I started looking at people differently, too, wondering what hidden fires smoldered behind their eyes, what nurseries had burned in their pasts that they had never spoken of. The world became a tapestry of invisible scars, a chorus of silent screams, and I, who had always been so sure of the solidity of things, now felt like I was walking on a thin crust over a bottomless, churning ocean of unseen history and shared, unconscious pain. The thrill of that night, the cheap frisson of fear we had initially felt, was gone, replaced by a deep, existential dread that has never truly left me. I know what I saw. I know what my mother told me. I felt the planchette move with a purpose that was not ours, and I touched the physical proof, the scar on the wall that confirmed it all. The Ouija board did not speak to the dead. It spoke to the living, to the secret, wounded parts of us that we bury the deepest. And it told me that nothing is ever truly forgotten, that our past is not just our own, and that the walls between minds are far, far thinner than any of us dare to believe. And the silence that followed in my apartment after I finished telling Eliza everything was a thick, suffocating thing, heavier and more profound than the quiet of the power outage that had started this whole nightmare. A silence that seemed to absorb all the normal, comforting sounds of the city outside. The distant wail of a siren, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic noise, leaving only the frantic, hammering rhythm of my own heart echoing in my ears, a percussive testament to the absolute demolition of my worldview. Eliza just stared at me, her face a pale mask of stunned comprehension, and I could see her own mind working behind her eyes, trying to fit this impossible, verified truth into the neat, orderly boxes of her understanding, and failing, just as I had failed, the reality of the scorch mark of my mother's tear-streaked confession, acting as an irrefutable anchor dragging all our comfortable skepticism down into the depths of something dark and uncharted. She didn't reach for a rational explanation, didn't try to comfort me with platitudes about coincidence or subconscious cues. The evidence was too overwhelming, the terror in my mother's voice too genuine, and she simply reached out and took my still trembling hand in hers, her skin cool against my feverish panic, a silent gesture of solidarity in the face of the unknowable. We sat like that for a long time, not speaking, because what was there to say? The facts were what they were. A secret buried for 3 decades had been telepathically exhumed by a piece of cardboard during a storm. The how was a black hole of terrifying possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was it some form of psychic resonance, my mother's intense, chronic fear creating a kind of permanent signal that the board had somehow tuned into? Was it a dreadful form of quantum entanglement, where 2 particles, or in this case 2 minds, remain connected across distance, so that the act of us asking the question somehow compelled her hidden memory to provide the answer? Or was it something even more ancient and dreadful, a property of the universe where profound emotional trauma leaves a stain not just on the mind, but on the very fabric of a location, a psychic fossil that we had inadvertently brushed against? My scientific mind, now completely unmoored, spiraled through these horrific hypotheses, each one dismantling another brick in the wall of my reality. The comfort I had always taken in the tangible, the explainable, was gone, replaced by a pervasive, low-grade terror that felt like a constant vibration in my teeth, a hum of existential dread that colored every waking moment. I started to see my life as a palimpsest, a document with a hidden, darker text written beneath the pleasant story I knew, and I became obsessed with re-examining every childhood memory, every family story, looking for other cracks, other inconsistencies, other secrets that might be lurking just out of sight. I'd look at a faded photograph of myself as a toddler, smiling in that sun-drenched nursery, and instead of seeing innocence, I'd see the ghost of the dresser that hid the scorch mark, the shadow of the replaced outlet, the invisible specter of smoke that had once filled my lungs. I began calling my mother more frequently, not to discuss the fire, which we never mentioned again, a silent pact of reburial hanging between us, but to ask seemingly innocuous questions about my early childhood, probing for other hidden truths, listening for the slightest hesitation, the faintest change in her vocal timbre that might betray another concealed horror. She answered my questions with a careful, weary patience, but I could hear the new distance in her voice, the sadness that her long vigil of silence had been broken, that the burden she had carried alone was now shared, and that I had become, in the process, a nervous, suspicious stranger sifting through the ashes of her past. My relationship with Eliza changed too. The playful curiosity that had defined our early days was replaced by a solemn, almost grim awareness of the uncanny. We never again broached the subject of Ouija boards or any form of spiritualism. It was as if we had touched a live wire and had no desire to test for voltage again. Our intimacy, once light and effortless, now sometimes felt like we were huddling together for warmth in a vast, cold, and inexplicable universe. And while the experience bound us together with the fierce glue of shared trauma, it also erected a subtle barrier, a knowledge that we had looked into an abyss together and could never unsee what we had found there. I found myself unable to concentrate at work, my focus shattered by the constant background hum of anxiety, the spreadsheets and reports feeling like meaningless abstractions compared to the visceral, world-shattering truth I had stumbled upon. I'd be in a meeting, nodding along to a presentation, and my mind would suddenly flash to the image of the planchette moving, that slow, deliberate slide to F, and a cold sweat would break out on the back of my neck. The world outside my window no longer looked like a collection of buildings and people going about their business. It looked like a stage set, a thin veneer behind which lurked impossible, whispering truths. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The intense, worried look on a commuter's face, the way an old house seemed to hold its silence, the strange, charged feeling in the air before a thunderstorm. And I wondered what hidden dramas, what private agonies, were being broadcast on frequencies I couldn't ordinarily perceive. The horror had become ambient, a permanent filter through which I viewed everything. And the most terrifying part was the absolute loneliness of it. The knowledge that I could never truly explain the depth of this shift to anyone who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the planchette's alien movement or touched the physical proof of a forgotten fire. I was a citizen of a new, terrifying country, and there was no passport back to the land of the blissfully ignorant. The Ouija board had not just revealed a hidden event, it had revealed the hidden nature of existence itself, and the message it spelled out, letter by dreadful letter, was that we are not alone in our own minds, that the past is not past, and that the universe is infinitely stranger and infinitely less private than we ever dared to dream.